Hello and welcome back to our series on Babylonia and Assyria. Today we are continuing on part 7. We're talking about the government and the military, how all of that ran, and all the little interesting bits and pieces in between. As usual, if you're liking the series, you can click the bell button and you'll get notified when the next part comes out. Or you can just wait for me to put it into a huge compilation and grind the whole thing out in an 8-hour session, if you are that way inclined. Alright, like, comment, subscribe, let's get going. The conception of the state in Babylonia was intensely theocratic. The kings had been preceded by high priests, and up to the last they performed priestly functions and represented the religious as well as civic powers. At Babylon, the real sovereign was Bel-Merodach, the true lord of the city, and it was only when the king had been adopted by the god as his son that he possessed any right to rule in any capacity. Before he had taken the hand of Bel, and thereby became the adopted son of the deity, he had no legitimate title to the throne. He was, in fact, a vice-regent and representative of Bel upon earth. It was Bel who gave him his authority and watched over him as a father over a son. The Babylonian sovereign was thus quite as much a pontiff as he was a king. The fact was acknowledged in the titles he bore, as well as in the ceremony which legitimized his accession to the throne. Two views prevailed, however, as to his relation to the god. According to one of these, sonship conferred upon him actual divinity. He was not merely the representative of the god, but a god himself. This was the view which prevailed in the earlier days of Semitic supremacy. Sargon of Akkad and his son Naram-Sin were entitled gods. Temples and priests were dedicated to them during their lifetime, and festivals were observed in their honor. Their successors claimed and received the same attributes of divinity under the third dynasty of Ur. Even the local prince, Gudea, the high priest of Tello, was similarly deified. It was not until Babylonia he had been conquered by the foreign Kassite dynasty from the mountains of Elam that a new conception of the king was finally introduced. He ceased to be a god himself, and became instead the delegate and representative of the god of whom he was the adopted son. His relation to the god was that of a son during the lifetime of his father, who can act for his father, but not actually take his father's place, so long as the latter is alive. Some of the earlier Chaldean monarchs called themselves sons of the goddesses, who were worshipped in the cities over which they held sway. They thus claimed to be of divine descent, not by adoption, but by actual birth. The divinity that was in them was inherited. It was not merely communicated by a later and artificial process. The divine right by grace of which they ruled was the right of divine birth. At the outset, therefore, the Babylonian king was a pontiff because he was also a god. In him the deities of heaven were incarnated upon the earth. He shared their essence and their secrets. He knew how their favor could be gained or their enmity averted, and so mediated between God and man. This deification of the king, however, cannot be traced beyond the period when Semitic rule was firmly established in Chaldea. It is true that Sumerian princes, like Gudea of Lagash, were also deified. But this was long after the rise of Semitic supremacy and the age of Sargon of Akkad, and when Sumerian culture was deeply interpenetrated by Semitic ideas. So far as we know, at the present of the apotheosis of the king was of Semitic origin. It is paralleled by the apotheosis of the king in ancient Egypt. It was there, too, that the pharaoh was regarded as an incarnation of divinity, to whom shrines were erected, priests ordained, and sacrifices offered. In early times he was, moreover, declared to be the son of the goddess of the city in which he dwelt. It was not till the rise of the 5th historical dynasty that he became the son of the sun god of Heliopolis, rather than Horus, the sun god himself. This curious parallel is one of the many facts which point to the intercourse between Babylonia and Egypt in the prehistoric ages. Whether the deification of the king originated first on the banks of the Euphrates or of the Nile, well, that must be left to the historians of the future to decide. Naram-Sin is addressed as the god of Akkad, or Akkad, the capital of his dynasty, and long lists have been found of the offerings that were made month by month to the deified Dungi, king of Ur, and his vassal Gudea of Lagash. Here, for example, are Dr. Shale's translations of some of them. Half a measure of good beer, 1, and 5 gin of sesame oil, on the new moon, the 15th day for the god Dungi, half a measure of good beer, and half measure of herbs for Gudea the high priest during the month of Tammuz. 2, half a measure of the king's good beer, half a measure of herbs on the new moon, the 15th day for Gudea the high priest. 1 measure of good wort beer, 5 cars of ground flour, 3 cars of cones for the planet Mercury during the month of the festival of the god Dungi. 3, half a measure of good beer, half a measure of herbs on the new moon, the 15th day for the god Gudea the high priest during the month Elul, the 1st year of Gimil-Sin, king of Ur. The conception of the king as a visible god upon earth was unable to survive the conquest of Babylon by the half-civilized mountaineers of Elam and the substitution of foreigners for the Semitic or Semiticized Sumerian rulers of the country. As the doctrine of the divine right of kings passed away in England with the rise of the Hanoverian dynasty, so too in Babylonia the deified king disappeared with the Kassite conquest. But he continued to be supreme pontiff to the adopted son of the god of Babylon. Babylon had become the capital of the kingdom, and Merodach, its patron deity, was, accordingly, supreme over the other gods of Chaldea. He alone could confer the royal powers that the god of every city, which was the center of the principality, had once been qualified to grant. By taking his hands, the king became his adopted son, and so received a legitimate right to the throne. It was the throne not only of Babylonia, but of the Babylonian Empire as well. It was never forgotten that Babylonia had once been the mistress of Western Asia, and it was, accordingly, the scepter of Western Asia that was conferred by Bel-Merodach up on his adopted sons. Like the Holy Roman Empire in the Middle Ages, Babylonian sovereignty bought it with a legal, though shadowy, right to rule over its civilized kingdoms of the world. It was this which made the Assyrian conquerors of the Second Assyrian Empire so anxious to secure possession of Babylon and there take the hands of Bel. Tiglath-Pileser III, Shalmaneser IV, and Sargon were all alike usurpers, who governed by right of the sword. It was only when they had made themselves masters of Babylon and had been recognized by Bel and his priesthood that their title to govern became legitimate and unchallenged. Cyrus and Cambyses continued the tradition of native kings. They too claimed to be the successors of those who had ruled over Western Asia, and Bel, of his own free choice, it was alleged, had rejected the unworthy Nabonidus and put Cyrus in his place. Cyrus ruled, not only by right of conquest, but because he had been called to the crown by the god of Babylon. It was not until the Zoroastrian Darius and Xerxes had taken Babylon by storm and destroyed the temple of Bel that the old tradition was finally thrust aside. The new rulers of Persia had no belief in the god of Babylon. His priesthood was hostile to them, and Babylon was deposed from the position it had long occupied as the capital of the world. But in Assyria, in contrast to Babylonia, the government rested on a military basis. It is true that the kings of Assyria had once been the high priests of the city of Ashur, and that they carried with them some part of their priestly functions when they were invested with royal power. But it is no less true that they were never looked upon as incarnations of the deity, or even as his representative upon earth. The rise of the Assyrian kingdom seems to have been due to a military revolt. At any rate, its history is that of a succession of rebellious generals, some of whom succeeded in founding dynasties, while others failed to hand down their power. There was no religious ceremony at their coronation like that of the taking the hands of Bel. When Esarhaddon was made king, he was simply acclaimed sovereign by the army. It was the army, and not the priesthood, to whom he owed his title to reign. The conception of the supreme god himself differed in Assyria and Babylonia. In Babylonia, Bel-Merodach was lord of the city. In Assyria, Assur was the deified city itself. In the one case, therefore, the king was appointed vice-regent of the god over the city, which he governed and preserved. In the other case, the god represented the state, and insofar as the king was a servant of the god, he was a servant also of the state. In both countries there was an aristocracy of birth based originally on the possession of the land, but in Babylonia it tended at an early period to be absorbed by the mercantile and priestly classes, and in latter days it's difficult to find traces even of its existence at all. The nobles of the age of Nebuchadnezzar were either wealthy trading families or officers of the crown. The temples and the priests who lived upon their revenues had swallowed up a considerable part of the landed and other property of the country, which had thus become what in modern Turkey would be called Waqf. In Assyria, many of the great princes of the realm still belonged to the old feudal aristocracy, but here again the tendency was to replace them by a bureaucracy which owed its position and authority to the direct favor of the king. Under Tiglath-Pileser III, this tendency became part of the policy of the government. The older aristocracy effectively disappeared, and instead of it we find military officers and civil officials, all of whom were appointed directly by the crown itself. While accordingly Babylonia became an industrial and priestly state, Assyria developed into a great military and bureaucratic organization. It taught the world how to organize and administer an empire. Tiglath-Pileser III inaugurated a course of policy which his successors did their best to carry out. He aimed at reviving the ancient empire of Sargon of Akkad, of uniting the civilized world of Western Asia under one head, but upon new principles and in a more permanent manner. The campaigns which his predecessors had carried on for the sake of booty and military fame were now conducted with a set purpose and method. The raid was replaced by a careful, planned scheme of conquest. The vanquished territories were organized into provinces under governors appointed by the Assyrian king and responsible to him alone. By the side of the civil governor was a military commander who kept watch upon the others' actions, while under them was a large army of administrators. Assyrian colonies were planted in the newly acquired districts, where they served as a garrison, and the native inhabitants were transported to other parts of the Assyrian Empire. In this way, an attempt was made to break the old ties of patriotism and local feeling, and to substitute for them fidelity to the Assyrian government and the god Ashur, in whose name its conquests were made. Of course, the taxes of the empire were carefully regulated. A cadastral survey was an institution which had long been in existence. It had been borrowed from Babylonia, where, as we have seen, it was already known at a very early epoch. The amount to be paid into the treasury by each town and province was fixed, and the governor was called upon to transmit it each year to Nineveh. Thus, in the time of Sennacherib, the annual tribute of Carchemish was 100 talents, that of Arpad 30, that of Megiddo 15, while at home Nineveh was assessed at 30 talents, and the district of Ashur at 20, which were expended on the maintenance of the fleet, the whole amount of the revenue raised from Assyria being 274 talents. Besides this direct taxation, there was also indirect taxation, as well as municipal rates. Thus a tax was laid upon the brick fields, which in Babylonia were economically of considerable importance. And there was an octroi duty upon all goods, cattle, and country produce which entered a town. Similar tolls were exacted from the ships which moored at quays, as well as from those who made the use of pontoon bridges which spanned the Euphrates or passed under them in boats. Long lists of officials have been preserved. Certain of the governors or satraps were allowed to share with the king in the privilege of giving a name to the year. It was an ingenious system of reckoning time, which had been in use in Assyria from the early period and was introduced into Cappadocia by Assyrian colonists. From Asia Minor, it probably spread to Greece. At all events, the eponymous archons at Athens, after whom the several years were named, corresponded exactly with the Assyrian limi, or eponyms. Each year in succession received its name from the eponym or officer who held office during the course of it, and as the lists of these officers were carefully handed down, it was easy to determine the date of an event which had taken place in the year of office of a given eponym. The system was of an Assyrian invention, and never prevailed in Babylonia. Their time was dated by the chief occurrences of a king's reign, and at the end of the reign a list of them was drawn up, beginning with his accession to the throne and ending with his death and the naming of his successor. These lists went back to an early period of Babylonian history and provided the future historian with an accurate chronology. Immediately attached to the person of the Assyrian monarch was the Rab-Sake, the chief of the provinces, or we may use the word vizier. He is called Rab-Shake in the Old Testament, by the side of whom stood the Rab-Saris, the Assyrian Rab-Sarisi, chief of the heads of departments. They were both civil officers. The army was under the command of the Tartanu, or commander-in-chief. The biblical Tartan, in the absence of the king, led troops to battle and conducted a campaign. Now, for example, when Shalmaneser II became too old to take the field himself, the armies were led by the Tartan Dayan Ashur, and under the Second Assyrian Empire, the Tartan appears frequently, sometimes in command of a portion of the forces, while the king is employing the rest elsewhere, sometimes in the place of a king who simply prefers to remain at home. In earlier days there had been two Tartans, one of whom stood on the right-hand side of the king and the other on his left. In order of precedence, both of them were regarded as of higher rank than the Rab-Shake. The army was divided into companies of 1,000, 100, 50, and 10, and we hear of captains of 50 and captains of 10. Under Tiglath-Pileser III and his successors, it became an irresistible engine of attack. No pains were spared to make it as effective as possible. Its discipline was raised to the highest pitch of perfection, and its arms and accoutrements constantly underwent improvements. As long as the supply of men lasted, no enemy could stand against them, and the great military empire of Nineveh was safe and sound. It contained cavalry as well as foot soldiers. The cavalry had grown out of a corps of chariot drivers which was retained through shrunken in size and importance, long after the more serviceable horseman had taken its place. The chariot held a driver and a warrior. When the latter was the king, he was accompanied by 1 or 2 armed attendants. They all rode standing and carried bows and spears. The chariot itself ran upon 2 wheels, a pair of horses being harnessed to its pole. Another horse was often attached to it in case of accidents. The chariots were of little good when the fighting had to be done in a mountainous country. In the level parts of Western Asia, where good roads had existed for centuries untold, they were a powerful arm of offense. But the Assyrians were constantly called upon to attack the tribes of the Kurdish and Armenian mountains who harassed their positions, and in such trackless districts where chariots were an encumbrance was simply no help. Trees had to be cut down and rocks removed in order to make roads along which they might pass. The Assyrian engineers indeed were skilled in the construction of roads of the kind, and the inscriptions not infrequently boast of their success in carrying them through the most inaccessible regions, but the necessity for making them suitable for the passage of chariots, that was a serious drawback, and we often hear of times how the wheels of the cars had to be taken off and the chariots conveyed on the backs of mules or horses. It was not wonderful, therefore, that the Assyrian kings, who were practical military men, soon saw the advantage of imitating the customs of the northern and eastern mountaineers, who used the horse for riding purposes rather than drawing a chariot. The chariot continued to be employed, however, in the Assyrian army, but it was more of a luxury rather than as an effective instrument of war. At first, the cavalry were little more than mounted horsemen. Their only weapons were the bow and the arrow, and they rode without saddles and with bare legs. At a latter period, the cavalry was armed with spears. Saddles were introduced too, and the groom who had run by the side of the horse, he disappeared. At the same time, under Tiglath-Pileser III, the rider's legs were protected by the leathern drawers, over which high boots were drawn, laced in front. This was an importation from the north, and it is possible that many of the horsemen were brought from the same quarter. Sennacherib still further improved the dress by adding it to closely fitting coats of mail. Of course, the infantry outnumbered the cavalry by about 10 to 1, and were divided into heavy armed and light armed. Their usual dress, at all events, after the foundation of the Second Assyrian Empire, consisted of a peaked helmet and a tunic which descended halfway down the thighs and was fastened round the waist by a girdle. From the reign of Sargon onward, they were divided into two bodies, one of archers, the other of spearmen, the archers being partly light-armored and partly heavy-armored. The heavy-armed were again divided into two classes, one of them wearing sandals and a coat of mail over the tunic, while the other was dressed in a long fringed robe reaching to the feet, over which a cuirass was worn. They also carried a short sword, and had sandals of the same shape as those used by other classes. Each had an attendant waiting upon him, with a long rectangular shield of wicker work covered with leather. The light-armed archers were encumbered with but little clothing, consisting only of a kilt and a fillet round the head. The spearmen, on the contrary, were protected by a crested helmet and circular shield, though their legs and face were usually bare. Changes were introduced by Sennacherib, who abolished the inconveniently long robe of the second class of heavy-armed archers and gave them leather greaves and boots. The first class, on the other hand, are now generally represented without sandals and with an embroidered turban with lappets on the head. Sennacherib also established a corps of slingers who were clad in helmet and breastplate, leather drawers, and short boots, as well as a company of pioneers, armed with double-headed axes and clothed with conical helmets, greaves, and boots. These pioneers were especially needed for engineering the way through pathless defiles and rugged ground over which the extension of the empire more and more required the Assyrian army to make its way upon. The heads of the spears and arrows were of metal, usually of bronze, but more rarely of iron. The helmets also were of bronze or iron, a leather cap being worn underneath them, and the coats of mail were formed of bronze scales sewn to a leather shirt. Many of the shields, moreover, were of metal, though wicker work covered with leather seems to have been preferred. Battering rams and other engines for attacking a city were carried on the march. Baggage wagons were also carried, as well as standards and tents. The tents of the officers were divided into two partitions, one of which was used as a dining room, while the other royal tent was accompanied by a kitchen. Tables, chairs, couches, and various utensils formed part of its furniture. One of these chairs was a sort of palanquin in the shape of an armchair with a footstool, which was borne on the shoulders of the attendants. The Assyrian army was originally recruited from the native peasantry, who returned to their fields at the end of a campaign with the spoil that they had taken from the enemy. Under the Second Assyrian Empire, however, it became a standing army, a part of which was composed of mercenaries, while another part consisted of troops drafted from the conquered populations. Certain of the soldiers were selected to serve as the bodyguard of the king. They had a commander of their own and doubtless possessed special privileges. The army was recruited by conscription, the obligation to serve in it being part of the burdens which had to be borne by the peasantry. They could be relieved of it by the special favor of the government, just as they could be relieved of the necessity of paying taxes. Now, the Babylonian army of Nebuchadnezzar and his successors was modeled on that of the Assyrians. We can gather from receipts for the provisions and accoutrements furnished to it how the army of Tiglath-Pileser or Sennacherib must have been fed and paid. Thus, in the first year of Nabonidus, 75 cars of flour and 63 cars of beer were provided for the troops in the camp near Sippara. And in the second year of the same king, 54 cars of beer were sent on the 29th of Nisan for the soldiers who had marched from Babylon. Similarly, in the 10th year of the same reign, we have a receipt for the dispatch of 116 cars of food on the 14th of Iyar for the troops which had marched to Sippara from Babylon, as well as 18 cars of general provisions provided for each day for the same purpose from the 15th to the 18th of the same month. In the first year of Nabonidus, 3 gur of sesame had been ordered for the archers during the first 2 months of the year, and as in his 13th year 5 gur of wheat were provided for the 15 soldiers. We may calculate that rather more than 2.5 bushels were allotted to each man. It may be added that at the beginning of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, we find a contractor guaranteeing the excellence of the beer that had been furnished for the army that had entered Babylon, rather, though it is possible that here artisans rather than soldiers are meant, we're not quite sure. Now, a register of the soldiers was also kept, but it would seem that those who were in charge of it sometimes forgot to strike off their names when they were either dead or discharged, and, of course, pocketed their pay for themselves. It's a little cheeky, isn't it? Well, at any rate, the following official document has come down to us. It reads as follows: the names of the deserters and dead soldiers which have been overlooked in the paymaster's account, the 8th day of Nisan, the 8th year of Cyrus, king of Babylon, and of the world, Shamash-Aki-Idin, son of Shamash-Anabitisu, and goes on for quite a few names after that. I'm not going to read all of them. Now, Liblud, son of Shamash-Eder, dead. Nebu-Tukte-Tiri, dead, and many more, in all 4 of them. Altogether 11 soldiers who have deserted or are dead. Now, if Babylonia copied Assyria in military arrangements, the converse was the case as regards to a fleet. The cry of the Chaldeans, according to the Old Testament, was "in their ships." And in the earliest age of Babylonian history, Eridu, which then stood on the sea coast, was already a seaport. But Assyria was too far distant from the sea for its inhabitants to become sailors, and the rapid current of the Tigris made even the river difficult to navigate. In fact, the rafts on which the heavy monuments were transported, and which could float only downstream, or the small round boats resembling kufas that are still in use, were almost the only means employed for crossing the water. When the Assyrian army had to pass a river, either pontoons were thrown across it, or soldiers swam across the streams with the help of inflated skins. The kufa was made of rushes daubed with bitumen, and sometimes covered with a skin. So little accustomed were the Assyrians to navigation that when Sennacherib demanded to pursue the followers of Merodach-Baladan across the Persian Gulf to the coast of Elam, he was obliged to have recourse to the Phoenician boat builders and sailors. 2 fleets were built for him by Phoenician and Syrian workmen, one at Tel Barsip near Carchemish on the Euphrates, and the other at Nineveh on the Tigris. These he manned with Syrian, Sidonian, and Ionian soldiers, and after pouring out a libation to A, the god of the sea, set sail from the mouth of the Euphrates. It was probably for the support of this fleet that 20 talents annually were levied on the district of Ashur. The Phoenician ships employed by the Assyrians were biremes with 2 tiers of oars. Of the Babylonian fleet, we don't really know very much. It doesn't seem to have taken part in the defense of the country at the time of the invasion of Cyrus. But the sailors who manned it were furnished with food, like the soldiers of the army, from the royal storehouse or granary. Thus, in the 16th year of Nabonidos, we have a memorandum to the effect that 210 cars of dates were sent from the storehouse in the month of Tammuz for the maintenance of the sailors. The king also kept a state barge on the Euphrates, like the dahabias of Egypt. In the 24th year of Darius, for instance, a new barge was made for the monarch, 2 contractors undertaking to work upon it from the beginning of Iyar, or April, to the end of Tisri, or September, and to use in its construction in a particular kind of wood. While we hear but little about the fleet, cargo and ferry boats are frequently mentioned in letters and contracts. Reference has already been made to the shekel and a quarter paid by the agent of Belshazzar for the hire of a boat which conveyed 3 oxen and 24 sheep to the temple of the sun god at Sippara, in order that they may be sacrificed at the festival of that year. 60 cars of dates were at the same time given to the boatmen. In the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, 3 shekels were paid for the hire of a grain boat, and in the 36th year of the same king, 4.5 shekels were given for the hire of another boat for the transport of wool. Some documents translated throw light onto the building and cost of the ships. One of them is as follows. A ship of 6 by the cubit beam, 20 by the cubit for the seat of its waters, which Nebo-Baladan, the son of Labasi, has sold to Sidiki, the son of Edina, for 4 manes, 10 shekels of silver, in 1 shekel pieces, which are not standard, and are in the shape of a bird's tail. Another contract relates to one of the boats on the pontoon bridges, which ran across the Euphrates and connected the 2 parts of Babylon together. 2 manes, 10 shekels of white silver, coined in 1 shekel pieces, not standard, from Musazib, the son of Pisaram, to Sisku, the son of Edina, the son of Egibi, Museb-Ibtim, and Narum, his female slaves. The wrist of Musazibtim is tattooed with the name of Edina, the father of Sisku. The money, which is for a ship for the bridge, has been given to Sisku. The contract is dated in the 26th year of Darius. A letter written in the time of Hammurabi throws some light on the profits that were made by conveying passengers. There were ships which conveyed foreign merchants to Babylon if they were furnished with passports allowing them to travel and trade in the dominions of the Babylonian king. They took it on their grounds and commodities along with them. On one occasion, we are told, The boat in which some of them travelled had been used for the conveyance of 10 talents of lead. It must, therefore, have been of considerable size and draught. That the army and navy should have been recruited from abroad was in accordance with that spirit of liberality towards the foreigner which had distinguished the Babylonians from an earlier period. It was partly due to the mixed character of the race, partly to an early foundation of an empire which embraced the greater portion of Western Asia, partly and more especially to the commercial instincts of the people. We find among them none of that jealous exclusiveness which characterized most of the nations of antiquity. They were ready to receive into their midst both foreigners and their gods. Among Assyrian and Babylonian officials, we meet with many who bear foreign names, and among the gods whose statues found a place in the national temples of Assyria were the Chaldees of Armenia and the divinities of the Bedouin. The policy of deporting a conquered nation was dictated by the same readiness to admit the stranger to the rights and privileges of a home-born native. The restrictions placed upon Babylonian and Assyrian citizenship seem to have been but slight. When Abraham was born at Ur of the Chaldees, Babylonia was governed by a dynasty of South Arabian origin, whose names had to be translated into the Babylonian language. Throughout the country, there were colonies of Amorites from Syria and Canaan, doubtless established there for purposes of trade, who enjoyed the same rights as the native Babylonians. They could hold and bequeath land and other property, could buy and sell freely, could act as witnesses in the case where natives alone were concerned, and could claim the full protection of Babylonian law. One of these colonies, known as the District of the Amorites, was just outside the walls of Sippara. In the reign of Zadok, the fourth successor of Hammurabi, a dispute arose about the title to some land included within it, and the matter was tried before the 4 royal judges. The following record of the judgment was drawn up by the clerk of the court, and it goes as following. 20 acres by 13 of land in the district of the Amorites, which was purchased by Ibni-Hadad the merchant, Arad-Sin the son of Edirim, has pleaded as follows before the judges. The building land, along with the house of my father, he did not buy. Ikbu, Annunit, and Dab-Ishtar, the sons of Shamash-Nazir, sold it for money to Ibni-Hadad the merchant. Idatum and Mazitum, the sons of Ibni-Hadad the merchant, appeared before the judges. They lifted up their hands and swore that it had been put up for sale. It had been bought by Edirum and Sin-Nadi-Su, who handed it over to Shamash-Nazir and Ibku-Annunit, selling it to them for money. The estate, consisting of 22 acres of land, enclosed by 30 other acres as well as 11 trees, and a house in the district of the Amorites, bounded by the upper end of the estate, and the lower end by the river Bukai, is contracted in width, and is aforesaid nature. Judgment has been given for Arad-Sin, the son of Erdirum, as follows. At the entrance to Sippara, the property is situated, and after being put up for sale, it was bought by Shamash-Nazir and Ikbu-Annunit, to whom it was handed over. Power of redemption is allowed to Arad-Sin. The estate is there, let him take it. Before Uruki Mansum the judge, Sin Ismayani the judge, Ikbu-Annunit the judge, and Ikbu-Elisu the judge, the 6th day of the month Tammuz, the year when Zadok, the king, constructed the very great aqueduct for the mountain and its fountain, for the House of Life. If we may argue from the names, Arad-Sin, who bought the action, was of Babylonian descent, and in the case this native Babylonians as well as foreigners could hold land in the district in which the Amorites had settled. But at any rate, in the eyes of the law, the native and the foreign settler must have been on equal footing. They were tried before the same judges, and the law which applied to the one applied equally to the other. It is clear, moreover, that the foreigner had as much right as the native to buy, sell, or bequeath the soil of Babylonia. Whether or not this right was restricted to particular districts, we do not know. In Syria, in later days, streets or rows of shops in a city could be assigned to members of another nationality by special treaty, as we learn from 1 Kings 34. And at the end of the Egyptian 18th dynasty, we hear of a quarter at Memphis being given to a colony of Hittite merchants. But such special assignments of land must not have been customary in ancient Chaldea. The Amorites of Canaan may have been allowed to settle wherever they liked, and the origin of the title District of the Amorites may have simply been due to the tendency of foreign settlers to establish themselves in the same locality. The fact that Arad-Sin seems to have been a Babylonian, and that his action was brought before Babylonian judges, is in favor of the view that such was the case. Moreover, Amorites could rise to the highest offices of state. Not only could they serve as a witness to a deed to which all other parties were native Babylonians, but they could also hold civil and military appointments. On one hand, we find the son of Abi-Ramu or Abram, who is described as the father of an Amorite, acting as a witness to a contract dated in the reign of the grandfather of Hammurabi. On the other hand, an Amorite has the same title of servant of the king as a royal judge, Ikbu Anunit. And among the Assyrians of the Second Empire, who were slavish imitators of Babylonian custom and law, we meet with more than one example of a foreigner in the service of the Assyrian government. Thus, in the reign of Sargon, 13 years after the fall of Samaria, the Israelites, Pekah and Nabadiah, who appear as witnesses to the sale of some slaves, are described, the one as the governor of the city, the other as a departmental secretary. The founder, again, of one of the leading commercial families at Babylon under Nebuchadnezzar and his successors, is entitled the Egyptian, and the clerk who draws up a contract in the first year of Cambyses is the grandson of a Jew, Bel-Yahu, meaning Bel is Yahweh, while his father's name, Nahit, is exalted, implies that an Israelitish Yahweh had been identified with the Babylonian A. Hebrew and Canaanite names appear in legal and commercial documents of the age of Hammurabi, and earlier by the side of names in purely native stamp, Jacob El and Joseph El, for instance, Abdiel and Ishmael, come before us with all the rights and privileges of Babylonian citizens. The name of Ishmael indeed is already met with on a marble stamp from Sippara, which is as early as about 4000 BC. In the time of Sargon of Akkad, the Babylonian governor of Syria and Canaan bears the Canaanitish name of Uru-Malik. And under the later Assyrian Empire, the Tartan of Commagene, with the Hittite name of Mar-Lara, was an eponym who gave his name to that year. Now it's probably right, as Mr. Pinchas has pointed out in earlier parts, in seeing the name Israel itself in that of a high priest who lived in the district of the Amorites outside Sippara in the reign of Ammi-Zadok. His name is written Sar-Ilu, and it was by his order that 9 acres of ground in the district of the Amorites were leased for a year from 2 nuns who were devotees of the sun god, and their nieces. 6 measures of grain on every 10 acres were to be paid to the sun god at the gate of Malgia, the women themselves receiving a shekel of silver as rent. That the women in the Amorite settlements enjoyed the same freedom and powers of the women in Babylonia is shown by the 2 documents, one dated in the reign of the 2nd king of the dynasty to which Hammurabi belonged, the other in the reign of Hammurabi's great-grandfather. In the first, Kuryatum, the daughter of an Amorite, receives a field of more than 4 acres, of which she had been wrongly deprived. In the second, the same Kuryatum and her brother Sumu-Ra are sued by the 3 children of an Amorite, one of whom is a woman, for the recovery of a field, house, slaves, and date palms. The case was brought before the judges of Beit Shamash, the temple of the Babylonians' sun god, who actually rejected the claim. At a very early period of Babylonian history, the Syrian god Hadad, also known as Rimon, had been, as it were, domesticated in Babylonia, where he was known as Amuru, the Amorite. He had come with the Amorite merchants and settlers, and was naturally their patron deity. His wife, Asherah or Asratu, was called by the Sumerians Nin-Marki, the mistress of the Amorite land, and was identified with their own Gubara. Nin-Marki, or Asherah, presided over the Syrian settlements, the part of the city where foreigners resided being under her protection, like the gate which led to the district of the Amorites beyond the walls. The following lawsuit came before the courts in the reign of Hammurabi, shows that there were special judges for cases in which Amorites were concerned, and they sat at the gate of Nin-Marki. It goes as follows. Concerning the garden of Sin-Magir, to which Nahid Amuri bought for money, Ilu Bani claimed it for the royal stables, and accordingly they went to the judges, and the judges sent them to the gate of Nin-Marki, and the judges of the gate of Nin-Marki. In the gate of Nin-Marki, Ilu Bani pleaded as follows: I am the son of Sin-Magir. He adopted me as his son, and the seal of that document has never been broken. He further pleaded that ever since the reign of that deified Rim-Sin Ariok, the garden and house that had been adjudged to Ilu Bani. Then came Sin-Mubalid, and claimed the garden of Ilu Bani, and they went to the judges, and the judges pronounced that, to us and the elders, that they have been sent to the gate of the gods Merodach, Susa, Nanar, Kusa, and Nin-Marki, the daughter of Merodach, in the judgment hall. The disputants have stood, and the elders before whom where Nahid Amuri first appeared in the gate of Nin-Marki have heard the declaration of Ilu Bani. Accordingly, they adjudged the garden and the house to Ilu Bani, forbidding Sin-Mubalid to return and claim it. Oaths have been taken in the name of the moon god, the sun god, Merodach, and Hammurabi the king. Before Sin-Imgurani the president, Edilka Sin, Amil Izitum, and so on. The seals of the parties are attached the 4th day of Tammuz, the year when Hammurabi the king offered up prayer to Tasmit. While a portion of the land was thus owned by foreigners, there was a considerable part of it which belonged to the temples. another part considered of royal domains, the revenue of which went to the privy purse of the king. The king could make grants of this to his favourites, or as a reward for services to the state. The Babylonian king, Nebo-Baladan, for example, gave one of his officials a field large enough, it was calculated, to be sown with 3 gur of seed, and Ashur-banipal of Assyria made his vizier, Nebo-Sar-Uzur, the gift of a considerable estate on account of his loyalty for the time that the king was a boy. All the vizier's lands, including the serfs upon them, were declared free from taxation, and every kind of burden. The men upon them were not to be impressed as soldiers, nor were the cattle or flocks to be carried away. It was also ordered that Nebo-Sar-Uzur, on his decease, should be buried wherever he chooses, and not in the common cemetery outside the walls of the city. Like the monarch, he may have his tomb in the royal palace, or in his own house, and imprecations were called down upon the head of anyone who wished to disturb his final resting place. The deed of gift and privilege was sealed, we are told, with the king's very own signet ring. A grant of immunity from taxation and other burdens could be made on the inhabitants of a whole district. There is in fact a deed that exists, signed by a large number of witnesses, in which Nebuchadnezzar I of Babylon, about 1200 BC, or thereabouts, makes a grant to the district of Bit Karzi Yabku, in the mountains of Namri to the east of Babylonia. We read within it throughout the whole district, neither the royal messengers nor the governor of Namri shall have any jurisdiction. No horses, fowls, mares, donkeys, oxen, or sheep shall be carried off by the tax gatherers. No stallions shall be sent to the royal stables, and no taxes of grain and fruit shall be paid to the Babylonian treasury. Nor shall any of the inhabitants be impressed for military service. It speaks volumes for the commercial spirit of the Babylonians that a royal decree of this character should have been thrown into legal form, and that the names of witnesses should have been attached to it, just as if it had been a contract between 2 private persons. The contrast is striking with this decree issued by the Assyrian king Ashur-banipal to his faithful servant Nebo-Sar-Uzur. All that was needed where the king of Assyria was concerned was his signet seal and royal command. But Ashur-banipal was an autocrat at the head of a military state. The Babylonian sovereign governed a commercial community and owed his authority to the priests of Bel. And with that, here we are once again at the end of this installment. I hope that you enjoyed it. Now, I will thank my top supporters: Dark, Kerry, Kimberly, Ember, Ben, Britt, Charles, Erin, James, Jeffrey, Melissa, Scott, Stark Factory, Wendy, Jaden, Jessica, Christine, Sally, Katiana, Christine, Fizabo, Legitmus, Maverick, Susan, Dr. Neuro, Nerd, Cameron, Alexander, Nicholas, Daniel, JR, and Charlene. Thank you so much. Do appreciate it. And with that, I will wish you all a good rest. And I hope you learned something. I'm sure you did. Otherwise, you've just wasted an hour. Unless you were simply watching it to become relaxed or fall asleep. In which case, the time was well spent. Good night, everyone. Lots of love to you all.